On the morning of January 12, 1888, the plains committed a kind of betrayal only the frontier could manage. By 10 o'clock, the air over western Nebraska felt almost merciful. Men stepped out without fastening their coats. Children made for school through a brightness that looked more like late March than deep winter. Horses breathed easy. Wagon wheels rolled without the brittle complaint frozen ground usually gives. The sky had a pale, washed stillness to it, and if you were tired enough, if you had spent weeks chopping wood, carrying water, patching roofs, and measuring flour with a careful hand, you might have mistaken that stillness for kindness. That was the first danger. The second was habit. People on the plains had learned to greet any soft weather with gratitude. You did not interrogate good fortune out there. You took it, because it never stayed long. And so chores continued. Fence lines were checked. Livestock watered. Bread dough kneaded. Children sent on errands. A traveling preacher pushed onward between claims on horseback. A few homesteaders even spoke aloud what had already entered their minds: maybe the worst of winter had passed. It had not passed. It was only gathering itself. A few miles from the nearest cluster of conventional claim shacks stood a house people had been mocking since autumn. It belonged to a widow named Elzbieta Novak, a woman in her mid-30s who had come west with 2 children, a tin trunk, a patched wagon tongue, and less money than most men spent roofing a shed. Her walls were not cut from lumber. They were not laid in sod. They were not framed the way a respectable settler's house was expected to be framed. They were built from tightly packed prairie straw, stacked thick and high and pinned together with sharpened stakes, then sealed with clay, ash, and chopped grass until the whole thing looked less like a shack than a fortress grown out of the field itself. The neighbors had laughed. They laughed when she started cutting and packing the tall blue stem. They laughed when she laid the bales in staggered courses like masonry. They laughed when she angled the front entry instead of cutting a straight door through the wall like everyone else. And they laughed hardest when she spent her last coins not on extra boards, but on a steeper roof and wider eaves. To most of them, straw was bedding. Fodder. Something that belonged under an animal, not around a family. To Elzbieta, straw was trapped air. And trapped air, whether she used that phrase or not, was the difference between life and death. The Central Plains punished assumptions. Eastern settlers arrived expecting trees and discovered distance. They expected easy fuel and found wind. They expected to build the way their fathers had built and quickly learned that inherited methods do not always survive a new landscape. Nebraska offered land under the Homestead Act, yes. But free land was not the same thing as a free life. Timber had to be hauled from rail towns at punishing cost. Nails mattered. Hinges mattered. Window glass mattered. Even a rough plank house could drain a family before the first crop ever broke ground. That is why so many built in sod. And sod, for all its strengths, came with its own burden: dampness, insects, crumbly edges, low light, and an intimacy with earth that not every family could endure. A sod house could keep the wind down, but it often brought the soil in with it. Elzbieta had seen those dugouts and soddies. She respected them. She simply did not want to raise children in one if another answer could be found. The answer stood all around her. The lower edges of her claim held a dense stand of prairie grass, tall and fibrous, the sort that bent hard in northwest wind without snapping. Most people saw rough cover or feed. She saw fiber, volume, and a material that, if kept dry, could hold still air in thousands of tiny pockets. The language of modern insulation had not yet reached her. No one on that claim would have spoken of thermal resistance or heat transfer. But frontier people understood results long before they understood formulas. A thin wall always begged the stove to work harder. A thick wall changed the argument entirely. So she built for thickness. Not prettiness. Not custom. Not pride. Thickness. And because she was observant in ways that kept people alive, she built not only for cold, but for wind, melt, snow load, fuel scarcity, and the peculiar cruelty of prairie weather, which could begin in comfort and end in killing. Elzbieta's first real invention was not the straw wall itself. Others in scattered places had experimented with baled grass for outbuildings and temporary shelter. Her true intelligence showed in how she assembled the whole system. She chose slightly raised ground near a shallow draw, but not inside it, so runoff would move away rather than gather under the floor. She set the long axis of the house off the ordinary claim line after standing in repeated wind and watching how gusts curled across the contour of the land. Instead of presenting a flat broadside to the prevailing blast, she turned the structure just enough to persuade wind to slide. Then she stacked the walls. Each bale was laid in offset courses so the seams never lined up. Wooden stakes were driven down through the layers to pin one course to the next. At corners she crossed the bindings and reinforced them with diagonal bracing because wind on the plains does not merely push, it twists. Between the bales she packed a mixture of clay soil, fine straw, and stove ash, creating a dense skin that cut drafts and discouraged moisture intrusion. The walls finished out nearly 2 feet thick. That one choice made her house strange to look at and extraordinary to live in. Where a thin board shack behaved like a box that leaked heat in all directions, her house behaved like a thermal reservoir. Once the interior warmed, the warmth did not rush back out into the dark. Once summer nights cooled the inner mass, the day's heat took hours to claw its way inward. The wall did not simply stop weather. It delayed it. That delay is one of the oldest survival advantages human beings ever discovered. Adobe villages knew it. Stone crofts knew it. Earth lodges knew it. Mountain people who slept against rock and turf knew it without naming it. Elsbeta, on an exposed claim under a Nebraska sky, rediscovered the same law with prairie grass and stubborn attention. Her roof mattered too. She pitched it steeper than local custom, so snow would not sit long enough to become a crushing burden. She pushed the eaves outward to shield the wall faces from rain and thaw. She whitened the interior plaster with lime and clay so it could throw back the little winter light available and help the room feel larger, cleaner, and less like an improvised shelter. Then she cut the entrance on an angle. That detail looked odd to nearly everyone who saw it. But a straight doorway is a tunnel for weather. A diagonal entry becomes a wind trap, a baffle, a place where snow and cold lose their direct path into the living space. On the plains, a door is not just a door. It is a negotiation with the storm. By the time the house stood finished, local opinion had settled into the familiar frontier mixture of amusement and doubt. Too crude, said some. Too strange, said others. Won't last till spring, said the experienced men. Elsbeta heard all of it and kept plastering. The first people to stop laughing were not the loudest men. They were the people who counted fuel. That is often how real invention is recognized, not with applause, but with arithmetic. By November, several homesteaders had noticed that smoke rose from Elsbeta's chimney less often than from houses no larger than hers. One woman, a seasoned settler named Martha Bell, came to visit under the practical excuse of borrowing yeast. She left having quietly inspected the wall thickness, the stove position, the sleeping platform, the door baffle, and the way the interior held a kind of still warmth even while wind tested the outer shell. "How much wood do you burn after dark?" she asked. Elsbeta gave her the number. Martha did not answer right away. Because she knew what her own family burned. Out on the plains, fuel was labor in solid form. Every pound of wood represented sawing, splitting, hauling, stacking, saving. A house that asked half as much of you over a winter was not merely comfortable. It altered the size of your survival burden. Soon the questions changed. Not why would you build that? But how fast can one be raised? That autumn, before the great storm, Elsbeta helped 2 neighboring families adapt the same method. One built a full straw-walled dwelling from scratch. Another used straw as an exterior insulating shell around an existing board frame, essentially wrapping a weak house in a thick winter coat. A third family copied only the diagonal entry and steeper roof, believing the rest too radical. That, too, is how frontier knowledge moves. Rarely all at once. Usually in pieces. One family adopts the whole lesson. Another borrows only the part they can believe. A third waits until weather humiliates them into learning. And weather was coming. Near midday on January 12th, the false gentleness began to tear. People later described the sky in different ways, because that is what memory does under fear. Some remembered a green-gray edge low in the northwest. Some said the cloud line looked less like weather approaching than a wall already standing at the horizon. Others remembered the silence just before it broke, how the air seemed to flatten, as though the world were holding its breath. Elsbeta was outside when she saw it. She did not know the exact numbers then. She did not know how fast the temperature would collapse, how vicious the wind would become, or how many would die across Nebraska, Dakota, and Minnesota in what history would later call the schoolhouse blizzard. She did not know any of that. What she knew was the look of danger. And experienced survival often begins right there, not with perfect information, but with fast recognition. She got off the roof where she had been checking the chimney flashing. She drove her children inside. She shut the inner panels over the windows. She fed the stove. She set extra water near the heat. She laid out blankets and dry clothing and checked the draft path and the angled entry. Then she waited. Elsewhere, people were still out. Children were still in schoolrooms. Men were still mending, traveling, carrying, delivering. The storm struck with the kind of violence that makes description feel inadequate. It did not arrive politely. It hit as a moving force: wind, driven snow, plunging temperature, disorientation all at once. In under an hour, comfort became exposure. Familiar landmarks vanished. Distance lost meaning. A quarter-mile could kill you. So could 50 yards. Thin-walled houses began to fail almost immediately in the way thin-walled houses fail, not by collapsing, but by bleeding heat until fear enters the room. Snow worked through cracks. Floors turned wet, then bitter. Stoves roared without winning. Families layered clothes over panic and fed their fuel piles like men bailing a leaking boat. Inside Elsbeta's straw fortress, the sound was terrible. But the performance was different. The walls took the shock. The baffle held. The stove did not have to chase every gust back out of the room, because the room was no longer bargaining directly with the outside air. The thick envelope moderated the assault. Warmth stayed where it was made. That night, while the world outside went white and murderous, her children remained alive not because the storm respected them, but because the house did not surrender what little heat they had. There is a lesson here older than the American frontier and broader than any one material. Most people think shelter is about keeping the weather out. But in extreme cold, that is only half the problem. The deeper problem is keeping your own heat in. A leaky structure can contain a stove and still fail its occupants. Fire alone is not enough if every surface around it is helping the cold steal what the fire produces. That is why some settlers burned astonishing quantities of wood in still-woken rooms barely above freezing. They were not heating a house. They were heating the plains through a bad wall. Elsbeta's house worked because it reduced exchange. The tightly packed straw trapped air. The clay and ash seals cut infiltration. The wall thickness slowed conductive loss. The offset seams prevented direct draft channels. The roof pitch reduced dangerous accumulation. The eaves protected the one weakness straw can never forgive: prolonged wetness. Even the angled entry reduced sudden cold flushing when the door opened. None of that was fancy. All of it was intelligent. Modern building science would eventually give these principles names. It would speak of R values: thermal mass, air sealing, moisture management, envelope continuity. Fine. Those are useful words. But the frontier knew the truth before the textbooks did. A good wall is one that lets a family sleep. That night, others did not sleep much at all. A preacher survived under his horse for hours in the whiteout. One ranch hand lost sensation in 3 fingers before dawn. A boy carrying a parcel to a neighboring place arrived alive only because he reached the door minutes before visibility disappeared. Across the wider region, many never reached any door at all. Elsbeta's house did not make the storm smaller. It made endurance possible. That distinction matters. Morning came hard and brilliant, the kind of post-blizzard light that turns the world into a field of knives. The drift stood high against lee walls. Fences vanished. Outbuildings seemed half buried. Breath flashed white and sharp in the air. People emerged carefully, measuring damage before speaking. Elzbieta opened her door through a drift packed against the outer passage. The inner threshold was dry. The chimney still drew. The roof had shed most of its burden cleanly. The wall faces remained intact. No slump. No burst joints. No soaked collapse. No ruin. One of the first men to come see it was a neighbor who had dismissed the whole project as peasant foolishness. He had spent the night in a board shack feeding his stove nearly without pause while his wife sat wrapped in quilts in fear. He stood looking at her house for a long while before asking the only question that mattered. What did it hold it inside? She told him. Then he asked how much fuel she had burned. She told him that too. You could almost watch the old certainty leave his face. On the frontier, a man might not apologize with words. But he would ask for instruction. That was apology enough. Within days, the laughter was dead. In its place came measurements, requests, labor offers, and the blunt practical humility that hard weather sometimes forces on proud people. Elzbieta helped one family seal and wrap a frame shack before the next cold snap. A carpenter who had once mocked her joinery returned to study the corners more carefully. This time he noticed what craftsmen always notice once contempt stops clouding the eye, the logic under the roughness. Her work was not elegant. It was effective. And effectiveness earns respect faster than polish in any landscape that can kill you. History books like clean inventions and single names. Frontier reality was messier and more honest. Elzbieta was not working in isolation from human history. She was participating in one of its oldest patterns, people under pressure rediscovering durable principles from local materials. Thick walls, sealed gaps, protected roofs, staged entries, shared labor, borrowed tricks. This is not the story of genius arriving from nowhere. It is the story of attention meeting necessity. After the blizzard, the technique spread in exactly the way useful knowledge spreads among practical people. A widow shared plaster method with a freedman's wife who knew clay from childhood. A carpenter refined corner joints he once doubted. A neighbor adapted straw insulation to an existing structure rather than rebuilding from scratch. Another copied the roof pitch before he copied the walls. Families compared overnight would use the way modern households compare utility bills. Every improvement was tested not in theory, but in weather. By the following cold season, several homes in that district had either straw bale walls, straw-wrapped exteriors, or baffled entries modeled on Elzbieta's original design logic. No committee had approved it. No engineer had stamped it. No newspaper gave her proper credit. It spread because people had watched it work when failure would have shown immediately. That may be the most frontier thing about the whole story. Truth was not decided by reputation. Truth was decided by winter. The reason stories like this matter is not nostalgia. It is accuracy. The 19th century frontier was not conquered by swagger. It was endured by observation, adaptation, and 1,000 unglamorous decisions made by people history often recorded poorly or not at all: widows, immigrants, laborers, older settlers, people without title, money, or public voice. They noticed what the land offered. They noticed what weather punished. They noticed what could be built quickly by tired hands before darkness and cold closed in. Elzbieta's straw fortress was not important because it was cheap, though it was. It was important because it reveals a permanent truth: resilience often looks ridiculous before the storm. A thick wall of pressed grass and clay does not impress a man who has spent his life admiring milled lumber and straight board lines. An angled doorway looks odd until wind tries to come through it. White eaves seem unnecessary until thaw and rain begin rotting careless work. A steep roof can look excessive until heavy snow tests the rafters. Common sense is frequently mocked by people who have not yet had to depend on it. Then weather arrives. And weather, unlike fashion, is not interested in appearances. The frontier asked only one serious question of any shelter, any stove system, any method, any tool: does it hold? Not whether it looks refined from the road. Not whether it resembles what was built back east. Not whether the neighbors approve. Whether it holds. Did the people inside remain warm enough to see morning? Did the fuel pile last? Did the roof stay overhead? Did the door still open? Did the children wake alive? That is the standard. It was the standard then. It is still the standard now, whatever materials we prefer to hide behind. If you strip this story down to its bones, what remains is simple enough to fit in a single sentence. She built with what the land could spare and what the weather could not easily defeat. That sentence contains half the wisdom of off-grid survival. Use what is near. Use what is abundant. Use what can be repaired. Use what reduces labor tomorrow, not just today. And above all, build for the worst week, not the best afternoon. That warm morning in January lied to almost everyone. Elsbeta built as if it might lie. That is why her walls mattered. Not because they were revolutionary in some grand modern sense, but because they were morally disciplined. They were built by a person who did not indulge optimism where weather was concerned. She looked at limited means, a dangerous landscape, 2 children depending on her, and a culture ready to dismiss anything unfamiliar, and she chose function over pride. There is a kind of frontier dignity in that. Quiet. Unsentimental. Exact. By spring, people who had laughed were measuring straw and cutting stakes. By summer, newcomers were being told to ask the widow with the thick-walled house before they started building. And in time, the method joined that long chain of human shelter knowledge that travels not through fame, but through usefulness. The names change. The materials change. The principle does not. A house is a machine for surviving weather. The best ones are not always the most expensive. They are the ones built by people who paid close attention. So when you picture the frontier, do not picture only rifles, wagons, and heroic silhouettes in the snow. Picture a woman on open prairie, nearly out of money, pressing clay into the seam between 2 bales of grass while her neighbors smirk. Picture her turning a doorway off-angle because she has watched enough wind to know better. Picture her pushing the eaves wider, steepening the roof, thickening the wall, not to make a statement, but to make morning possible. Then picture the blizzard. Picture the board houses hissing with drafts. Picture stoves fed nearly to exhaustion. Picture fear sitting in rooms where cold entered faster than comfort could be made. And then picture, a little way off, one strange thick-walled house holding its warmth in the dark while the storm screams across the plains. That is not romance. That is survival. And survival, on the frontier, was the closest thing to truth most people ever got.